Good evening, Toli, and thank you so much for allowing us the opportunity to just articulate our statement. So our statement is very clear, Toli. It's about unlawful evictions, wherein there are no court orders. And we are saying that should be condemned and should definitely not be happening, especially in a country where we uphold the law and really respect the rule of law. Now, what has now been played just now, well, what the Premier is saying, it looks like he is saying that he is going to act within the prescripts of the law. But you see, what becomes a challenge is the other utterances that unfortunately were not played just now, which were about the eviction that was to take place in the early hours of the morning around 2 o'clock. And that is where we are concerned, because when you evict people, you're talking about families, where not only do we have those that are running the household, but we also have women and children. And you are likely to have persons with disabilities and older persons. And for us, that is a concern, that those are the marginalized, and those are the most vulnerable members of our communities that must be safeguarded. So even if eviction does take place, Toli, it must still take place within the prescripts of the law, and it must be done with humility.
Yeah. Some people are going to say, and I can just almost see this happening, Operation Dudula, they will say lawlessness has reached crisis proportions, much like the Premier is saying, and therefore, if people have occupied buildings or have gone and erected informal dwellings unlawfully, why should there be court orders to try and remove them from an area which they occupied illegally in the first place?
Unfortunately, Toli, we have laws in our country. Amongst others, we are talking about the PI Act, which is very deliberate in protecting those that unlawfully occupy premises. And it's got a time frame. They're looking at 6 months period. Now, that gives our municipalities, the government officials, and anyone else who owns the building to be able to act within that period. But once it goes over that period, now you will be forced to then adhere to what the law says. And the law says that those are unlawful occupiers and they must be dealt with in terms of the PI Act. So you cannot just remove them as you'd want to remove them. But unfortunately, you are now forced to follow the process of the law. From how we see it, Toli, the lawlessness comes as a result of not having enough monitors of the very buildings. These are buildings that are either under public works or they are under our own municipalities. They are supposed to be safeguarded. They are not supposed to be left for anyone to take over them.
Yeah.
Once that happens, that is the result of what we are now dealing with.
So on the part of the unlawful occupation of buildings that are not in use, that is government's own ineptitude, that they leave these buildings unattended, and therefore people who are homeless, they need shelter. They will probably get in there if there is no one to prevent them from doing that. So let's move from that and talk about illegal shack dwellings. How is the Premier supposed to act within the law in that regard? These are illegally erected structures. What does he do?
Again, yes, these are areas that are within municipalities. In municipalities, you've got managers. You're supposed to have people that are safeguarding areas in their own municipalities who are able to report when there is an informal settlement that is being erected so that the municipality can act timelessly. But usually, what happens is our municipalities, they let these things to happen over a period of time, and unfortunately then encroaches onto the PI Act. Ultimately, we have got people that would have been staying in an area for more than 12 months. Unfortunately, when that happens, you will be forced to follow the process of the law. You cannot go against the law. But if our municipalities were ensuring that we've got people that are employed, which can even mitigate the issues around employment, in our country, who are monitoring these issues to safeguard these areas, to safeguard, any property that belongs to government, we would not be faced with this situation. Because the truth is that actually, in other municipalities, they are not faced with the similar challenges. Why? Because they are ensuring that someone has got their ear on the ground to report on these possible informal settlements that might be erected.
Let's wind down on the conversation, Commissioner, and here's a scenario for you. So here are red ants, and I'm merely using those because that's who we've become familiar with, not to say that they probably will be the ones used here. I'm merely using this as an example. Here they are evicting people, and the Premier says, well, I couldn't do anything about this because the Human Rights Commission is on my neck saying that I'm doing things illegally. This scenario I'm painting to you is that the Premier may be tempted to use this as a political tool against you, a Chapter 9 institution. What are you going to do when he decides to pit members of the public against you from saying, I'm trying to do the right thing in order to decrease criminality within this community, but here's a Human Rights Commission saying that I can't do this? What do you do?
The Human Rights Commission is very clear, is not saying that lawlessness must prevail in the country. The Human Rights Commission is only saying that the Premier must not allow such situation to prevail and then act unlawfully. You cannot mete out an unlawful act with an unlawful act. Premier should have at all times been on guard with regard to his areas. He must have people on guard to make sure that properties are safeguarded. And that way he would not mete out an act that is unlawful. He would not find himself wanting. So what we are saying is Premier must just act, but he must just act within the prescriptions of the law. That's all we are saying. We are not saying that he must allow lawlessness to continue, but he must continue to act, but he must be mindful of things that he says, for instance, talking about 2 o'clock, early hours of the morning, evicting people, and also he must act within the prescriptions of the law because municipalities, in terms of the PI Act, are supposed to provide alternative accommodation whenever they remove people. That is what the law says. The Human Rights Commission is looking at what the law says. We are not acting outside the prescriptions of the law. We are saying let's all observe the rule of the law. Thank you so much, Tony.
Finally, Commissioner, in your statement, you've mentioned the Ministers of Human Settlements. I think that's quite obvious. And then the Minister of COGTA as well. What will their role be in these evictions?
Yes, so they are responsible, amongst others, really for issues around land and municipalities, and also SAHRC responsible for local government. It is our intention to have a conversation with them to say where there are already informal settlements, they need to look at them and see how best they can ensure that same are resolved, but within the prescriptions of the law. That's what we want to have a conversation about, and we hope that they will accede to our request that we are going to make to them so that we can, talk about this around the table. And hopefully we can come back to you, Collie, and say at least they've undertaken to come about with a plan that, will run for a certain period of time, and hopefully human rights would not be violated, which South African Human Rights Commission is about. It's about just that, to protect human rights and nothing else. Thank you so much.
South African Human Rights Commissioner Nomahlubi Khwinana, thank you very much for your time tonight.